Are. Actually, you know what I'd like to do is I'd like to do one thing which I think is very emblematic. Maybe one day it'll become a symbolic form of greeting among podcasters. What do you think? Actually, I'm listening to a podcast on how to give a speech before a group of 150 people. Now I'm going to switch to a podcast on how to remove the earbuds without causing damage to the cloaca. Or is it the cornea? Or the caramba. Anyway, it's wonderful to be here. My gosh, anytime anybody whose business is broadcasting gets to see a live audience, it's like a reaffirmation that you're really possibly getting to somebody, and that's kind of why you got involved in the first place, because it sure isn't the money, at least not in public broadcasting. In the spirit of that, I'm gonna give you a very low-tech presentation. So low-tech, as a matter of fact, that if you'd like, you can close your eyes, and we can turn off the lights, because I want to talk about sound, just sound. And in particular, what does it mean to have and develop a voice for a podcast, which hopefully will improve your relationship with your audience? It raises a very interesting question also of what's your audience, which I'm going to try to say a few things about. But I'm going to keep my remarks as much as possible to just my own personal experience, which includes, what is it, a year and a half now with podcasting. Like some of the people here, I was what they call, one of the pioneers. And that, for whatever reason, in October of 2004, I felt I just simply had to start podcasting. I didn't know why, but I was passionate enough, there's your word, about it, that I was able to convince a huge operation like WGBH to get involved. And by gosh, they did. And it's an incredible tribute to what that public radio station does, that big as it is, it's still responsive to what was at that point tiny little changes in the landscape that might end up leading to a very different form of broadcasting. And that's beginning to happen. This isn't the day to talk about it, but really to study how an operation like WGBH has responded to what would otherwise be the terrible disruption and threat of podcasting is very inspiring. We're known around the station, that is Morning Stories, WGBH Morning Stories, our little podcast. We're known as the tugboat because we were really the first at the operation there to kind of venture out and to, little by little, pull this huge operation which involves television broadcasts, radio broadcast, lots of other operations into what might be new waters. And the pay is comparable, too, I might say. One fish a day, Anyway, I'm going to just talk about my experience with Morning Stories, and probably that's going to mean my experience as a broadcaster as well. I've spent about 35 years in public broadcasting, both radio and television. So, and then I'm going to try to save a little time for more than one question, because I'm talking about a very specific personal experience with this medium. And Doug, how many podcasts are out there now? 30,000, 40,000, 50,000?
Could be, yeah.
Nobody knows, but they're bound to be different. To the extent that they're podcasts, they're going to really reflect the personality and the passions of the podcaster. So for me to presume that anything that I have to say may be relevant to them is crazy. And to assume that there are even rules for how to shape your sound, it would be like trying to channel Niagara Falls into a faucet, like your cold water sink, a faucet, because it's just too huge. All you can do really is appreciate how big it is, how much bigger it's going to get. Pitch in if you're interested in doing it, and also stand back a little bit in awe at what's happening, because it is a revolution. Well, let me start with a few general observations that I've made about podcasting. And these are generalizations, but they're things that clearly have hit me over the head, if not immediately, then within a couple of days about podcasting. One is that podcasting audiences are very, very different from broadcast audiences. I spent a lot of time thinking about my relationship with audiences because in public-supported broadcasting, they're the ones who pay the bills. They're the ones who keep bread on my table and keep me on the air. And ever since 1970 or 1790, I can't remember which, when I started doing this, they're the ones that I really have to be addressing. And they give enormous financial support, they give enormous moral support, but when it comes to emotional attachment and to a desire to participate creatively in what you're producing, they are nowhere near what a podcast audience is. And this leads me to generalization number 2. Podcast audiences aren't just on your side. Depending upon how you approach them, they want to get into bed with you. They want to be part of the process of what you are doing. Take pledge time, please. Those of you who listen to public radio often know that that's the time you really have to struggle with the desire to tune off. You know, yes, you know it's all about contributing, but you hate to hear someone nattering away at you. Help me, help me, help me. This is 3 more reasons why you should give money to the station, and if you're lucky, you may even get a car or something else. Or you can give us your car, and it'll be a tax, you know, every year it's something different. So that's your broadcast audience, even the most devoted ones. Ask a podcast listener to do something for you, and an amazing number of them are going to come through. 2 weeks ago, for instance, just to raise our presence on iTunes, we asked our listeners in a podcast if they would write, hopefully, a favorable review for us. They could be included as part of that section in the iTunes store where you hear what other people think of your program. And overnight, we got about 20 reviews that we were able to put in. And what's interesting, and I'd like to say it's all because of our show, but I don't think that would be more than a quarter of the truth. They were all 5-star reviews. And 20 people who all think that your podcast is the best thing they have ever heard and it's changed their lives is an indication of where the audience is at, what their relationship to podcasting is. It's that important to them. There was a survey, and as Doug has pointed out, these statistics, God knows what they mean, but you know, I found this one particularly interesting. There was a survey that was done of, I think, 40,000 podcast listeners, and I don't know who did the service. What? I'm blanking on. Thank you very much. See, you're a podcast audience. Already I'm getting your participation. So actually, let me ask you to participate in this survey with me, because I'll tell you what they said, and you can tell me if, you know, as a group, you respond the same way. All right, 40,000 podcast listeners. They filled out this survey via links that were provided by hundreds of podcasters. When asked how much of a podcast they subscribed to or downloaded, they listened to, well, I won't tell you what percent listen to all of it, but for those of you who download podcasts, how many of you listen to all of it? Well, I'm seeing about a third of the hands going up, and I didn't even ask how many people have downloaded a podcast. I assume that's all of you. Well, that's I'd say maybe closer to 50%. The statistics there were 88% said they listened to all of it. 11% said they listened to 75% of it, and only 1% listened to half of it or less. So that means, according to this, 99% of your listeners are with you all of the way, and no more than half bail out before halftime. So talk about supporting the local team. This is not your average broadcast audience. They also asked in this survey, on a scale of 1 to 10, how they would rate the following attributes as most important in the podcast they listen to, 1 to 10. Content was number 1, 9.32 out of 10 people. I should have this up on the screen, but 9.32 out of 10 thought that content was the most crucial. The host or the hosts, 8.73 out of 10. Audio quality was number 3. Care to guess what number 4 was? Anybody have any idea what quality they considered to be the 4th most important for a podcast?
Audience participation?
Audience participation. Well, close. Any other guess? Length. That's interesting. I'm sure that's part of the consideration. No, it was reliability. And by that, they meant that new episodes were always available when promised. That was 7.88 out of 10. The way I read that is that podcast audiences are looking for a subject that matters to them, a person who embodies that subject, who embodies the enthusiasm in some way that they feel for it, and a serious relationship where everybody shows up. So this is kind of like going steady. And I found that this spirit of collaboration really holds true in the relationship that podcasters have with each other. I probably shared more ideas and production tips and information with my fellow podcast producers this past year than I have with all of my colleagues in professional broadcasting in the last 35 years. One reason I think for this is that podcasting, and you'll be hearing a lot of things about what podcasting is. Well, it is a technical innovation to some extent. It's kind of like taking some pieces that were there and putting them together in a new way. It's also certainly a new form of distribution, a way of getting to your audience. But third, well, maybe not but third definitely, is that it's a community. It's a collection of sub-communities, if you like, which are all built around a common topic or a subject or an idea. And however different the podcasts might be from each other, the podcasters, I think as a whole, feel that they're part of a movement to share that passion, much more than they are part of a market to sell a product. So that's observation number 3. For the present, podcasting is still more about making connections than it is about making money. And that means that when money isn't an issue and greed isn't a factor limiting your imagination and your passion, in a sense, all forms and formats are up for grabs. Anything really still can go in creating a podcast that becomes your podcast. There is no particular approach that's going to make anyone a lot of money. So that means that there's less inducement to imitate and more room to improvise, ideally at least. And so far, that seems to be the way it's working out. Broadcasting, of course, is a completely different world, and there's no need for the sake of time to go into all the ways that it's different. But when it comes to the sound of a host, I would like to make one distinction. In broadcasting, you can command attention as a host by the sheer force of your personality or your point of view. But what podcast listeners seem to expect from a host, and you can call this, I guess, generalization number 4, as a genuine human being with a voice that is personal, a voice that's natural, with a voice that's for real. There is a lot of scientific evidence, if you're interested, that although most people feel that seeing is believing, hearing is probably more important even than seeing when it comes to the way that we really evaluate another person that we're in a relationship with. And when it comes to sounding natural, I have tried in my career in broadcasting for 35 years to sound as natural as I can. And maybe I'm 80% of the way there to what I think I'm capable of. But the way that I've done that, one of the ways certainly, is to imagine when I'm broadcasting that I am speaking to a specific human being that I care for. And it's amazing, I may be doing a broadcast about international news, and I may be thinking of, well, I was at one point thinking of my 7-year-old son. But somehow that gave me the feeling that I needed to somehow embody why I felt this particular issue was important and needed to be explained or at least presented to somebody that I care for. In podcasting, this is certainly part of the process, but I think there's one more factor that I've been learning I also have to keep in mind when I'm podcasting to the podcast audience. I have to keep in mind not only a person I'm talking to that I care for, but a person who really, as soon as I'm finished talking, wants to talk back to me. And this is generalization number 5. Podcasting, to me, is basically a conversation. And if you produce a podcast, you may know what I'm talking about. People who download you often act like they're involved in a relationship with you. You did not come to them out of thin air. You didn't come to them in the middle of the program, as somebody else pointed out. They went, found you, and they downloaded you. And if they liked you, they're not just going to listen to you. Chances are, we seem to be getting this impression from our email anyway, and we hear from thousands of people ultimately, we've heard from 1,000 people, that they integrate you into some kind of listening ritual. It's a part of their life. Maybe while you're running, maybe while you're in the shower, although public radio broadcast listeners tend to listen to you in the shower. I think it's hard with an MP3 player, so not so much in the shower. But they may listen to you on the way to work. A lot of people listening to us on the subways in New York, in Sydney, Australia, on the tube, in London. They may listen to you to put them to sleep. You can't win them all. But in all of those cases, you are with them, they have taken you along, and they very often want to talk back to you. I think Dan was saying, that he was running with the Gilmore gang. Well, in a sense, if he were, he would probably want to turn to one of them and say, I really like the point that you made, but have you considered this or whatnot? When we first started Morning Stories, we had to go out and we had to find our storytellers and hopefully find them in an area that was still no more than a cheap cab ride away from our studios at Channel 2. And today it's not unusual to begin a Morning Stories with, we just got this wonderful email from someone in California or Sydney, Australia, or Tokyo, and it'll be a story that often is a story they sent us in response to a story that they heard on the podcast. And this idea of connecting with each other and forming the community is actually something we've begun to build into a story of its own. Not so long ago, just to give you an example, we got an email from a woman in Curitiba, Brazil. I'm not sure exactly where that is, but I think it's the southern part of the country. And she wrote to say how much she enjoyed one particular story that she had heard that was told by a guy who, as a personal project, decided to walk every street in Manhattan. So we fashioned a story, the story that he told, but we concentrated on the part where we really talked about how it was a way that he got to learn where he lived. And it also brought him in touch. It was like a walk through time, too, because he began to experience what the life of his family had been like in the previous generation by going to some of the neighborhoods where they had been. He even ended up going to a particular place where his grandfather had been held by the police when his grandfather was 12 years old because they mistook him for somebody who had robbed a delivery person. And he was in tears when he suddenly was back in that very same place that he was sure his grandfather had been at the age of 12. In any event, she wrote to tell us how much she enjoyed that story. And the way that she talked about it made me feel, I got to talk to this person in person. So we called her up in Curitiba, got her phone number, asked her if it would be okay. She said, yeah, and we recorded the conversation. And I thought, there's a story that's probably going to happen in the course of our conversation, and maybe we can use that as another morning story. And we got into some situations that did make wonderful stories. There was this huge thunderstorm that was going on when I called her, and you could hear it through her telephone. And in fact, not unlike that sound, is boom in the background. So you didn't have to have brilliant audio quality to understand that this was a huge sound, because every time the sound would happen, she would say, Jesus! And she was a devout woman. I mean, she meant Jesus. And then, oh, Christ, she said at one point. And then Jesus a few more times after that. I thought, well, this is great. This is a real person talking. Then it occurred to me, we did a story in the past about a woman from another part of Brazil named Fatima. And her story was about how she came to the United States as an illegal immigrant and decided to go back home. And the reasons that she went back home will break your heart. She's the kind of person America really needs. She was devoted to all the things that the state stood for, but she was terrified after 9/11 that she would be picked up, and she couldn't stand the idea of her children seeing her in handcuffs. She believed in their right to have an education and to be protected from all the things that poverty had brought her own childhood in Brazil. So anyway, I love Fatima, and everybody who hears this story loves Fatima. Fatima lives in her voice. In any event, I told this woman whose name was, her last name was Giulio. What was her? Aurea Giulio. I said, Aurea, did you hear the story, the morning story that we did about Fatima? She said, oh, yes, that was a very good story. I said, would you like to say hi to Fatima? She said, oh, very much, I'd love to do that. So we gave her Fatima's phone number, And then a day later, we get a phone call from Fatima saying, Tony, you know, and Gary, who was my assistant on the program and the co-host, said, you know, it was so nice to hear from Aurea. And so we ended the podcast as a little bit of a surprise with a message from the answering machine of Fatima suddenly calling back. And what we had traced was the whole community in that one little story that has been forming naturally around podcasting. So I don't know where that takes me, but give me a second to find out here. Because what time is lunch? I gotta. What?
You've got 20, 25 minutes.
25. And I really would like your questions. So I'm going to buzz through some other stuff here. Maybe what I should do is just tell you a little bit about some of the other things that we do in morning stories to try to preserve the quality that I think I hope I'm conveying to you that we want to get from a storyteller on morning stories, and that is authenticity. We would like people who are telling us a story, whatever that story is, and whoever they are, and the more average everyday person they are, the better, because everybody has got wonderful stories to tell if you only listen for them. What we try to do is to get them to tell the story in the same way that somebody bangs on your door and tells you about something amazing that just happened outside on the street. We want to get them at that moment where they are experiencing the experience they're talking about, because that's the point at which people tend to make a story out of it. And the more you can get that, the more you can experience it as an experience, the more you can realize what it's like to be the other guy. And the more you can realize that despite the differences between your lives and anything else between you, on that human level, you understand each other perfectly. You know what it would be like to be that person. You may even be that person. So, and we're doing that all the time, but how do you catch it in a podcast? Well, and how do you catch it in a broadcast? Like maybe I'll say a little bit about how our broadcast and our podcast differ right at the end. But the podcast gives us infinite freedom to really explore a lot of different ways to do it. Because, as somebody else pointed out earlier, the podcast audience out there is very welcoming. They are very forgiving. You can blow it on a podcast, and they don't mind, as long as you say, I blew it. Imagine doing that on a broadcast on a regular basis. Probably would make broadcasting rather interesting again, you know, and I think about it. Maybe I'll try that next, because I often feel that way. Anyway, you know, you can take an idea, you can turn it into an element in your podcast very quickly, because this technology lets you turn something, a sound, to tape, and you can edit it quickly if you feel it needs editing, and you can get a response immediately from people. You put it up as a podcast. If they download your podcast, they can give you an email right back. So in that sense, it's also a conversation that's going on between you. What do we do in morning stories to try to keep this authenticity in people's stories? And here's a case where what we do may not at all apply to the podcast you want to do, but what we're trying to do is apply these generalizations that I've had about, you know, relationships and feeling at ease and that you're connecting with another person. Well, our stories can come from two basic roots we've discovered. One is a person may decide to write down their story and then come into the studio and read it. That's great. Fewer and fewer people are doing that. I'm not exactly sure why, but, you know, I assumed at the beginning that that was kind of the way it was going to be, to the extent that public radio had told me that, you know, that's what people tend to do. Public radio tends to call them commentaries, but commentaries actually do sound kind of read. They often don't have that quality of the person really speaking at you, really speaking into you. So when people start to read what they've written, they tend to lose that tone. They tend to lose that quality. So that was a problem we had. How can we get somebody who wants to write their story and whom we've already worked on so that the script is really as close to a spoken account as possible? How do we get them to read it so that it sounds like it's happening to them there and then? Well, one thing we do is we let them read it any number of times, get comfortable with the situation, maybe even give us here and there a moment where a reading of a line really is genuine, because the feeling does occur to them at that point and gets reflected in the tone. But basically, we hope that what they will do is get very used to relating to us and very bored with the process of having to read this thing again and again and again. Meanwhile, of course, we're directing them, and I'm saying, could you try this? And they're going, or that last paragraph, could you emphasize just this a little bit? Because I think you're feeling that, They get bored with that process. Then I come in, and I may sit down with them so that they have eye contact with me and say, how about you're telling me the story? And at that point, they've pretty much got the story together in their own minds and the order in which things happen. And if they don't, I'll ask them to tell me the story a paragraph at a time. And what I will do is kind of like respond to them, often just by looking, by showing some emotional reaction, by maybe asking a question that gets them right to the emotion that they really had at that moment. Like, well, you did that, okay, and then what happened? Well, the thing that happened next is in the next paragraph. So you say, and then what happened? And they put away the paper, and they tell me in that paragraph what happened. From that, we get a lot of great readings, but not necessarily terrific ones all of the way through. But now we have two elements, which is a reading from the script that had a moment or two in it, a telling of the thing, which had many more of those moments to it. We have a third thing, of course, which we hadn't realized until we started doing this as a podcast. We record everything. So we also have their sounds, their sighs, in the process of just simply being in the recording session and sometimes being told, could you try doing this? Yeah. Oh, or a breath. Those are all very natural expressions. Those carry the tone of the person too. And they're available to us in an edit so that we can slip it in at a point where it seems appropriate. So you can actually have, in some of our stories, little moments where a person's behaving exactly like a real person. You may not be conscious of it, but they'll suddenly sigh because of something that they've just said. And it will give you time to feel that as well. Because part of telling stories is also the silences, the spaces between the events as well as the events. And that's something you can put in the editing too. The other route by which we get stories is through an interview that the person will have with me. We'll ask them if they want to come in and spend an hour in the studio, and we'll have two mics, and we'll go back and forth. Usually they'll start with a story that we've already decided they want to tell, something that's a part of their repertoire. They've maybe had some experience already telling the story and getting a good response to it. But again, for most people who aren't professional actors or experienced storytellers, and those are not the people we're after. We're after your average, everyday person. For them, retelling is very different from telling. There's that feeling that they've already been there telling the story, and they may be looking over their shoulder, and they may have forgotten what the real feeling was when they first told that story. So, we may be able to get a great story from them, but rarely do we get it from something they think they're going to want to tell the story about. What tends to happen, and this is wonderful, is that in the course of the conversation during that hour, as they're talking about or moving into the story or telling the story they're telling about, other things will come up for them, which, because we're having a conversation, I can sort of guide them to. Another story that's related to the story they want to tell may be occurring to them, something else that happened at the same time, or out of the blue, suddenly a memory they had about somebody who did something. And if you're listening, this little element just suddenly hits you, and you say, I was there for a second. Wherever there was, they just took me there. Concentrate on that. Say someone's going blah, 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 the red couch grandmother sat in, blah, 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 blah. And you say, whoa, what about, can you tell me a little bit more about the red couch? Was that red couch something that you can remember being there all the time? Did you ever sit on that red couch? And then a story will start to happen. And really what's happened is that kind of moment, which I think as human beings we're all hardwired for, which is that we're having an experience we want to convey as an experience to another person. And so it takes the form of a story. This is the way we connect. This is a story that means something to us because we filled in the picture from our own experience, and we then want to tell it to somebody else. The best proof that you've heard of a story that matters is that you want to tell it to somebody else. unless it's about something incredibly personal. That is the infectious quality of real stories, because we tell stories to make sense of an experience, to give something as an experience to somebody else, and sometimes to make it make sense to us, to ourselves, in the course of telling it. We tell stories to explain ourselves to ourselves, too. So sometimes in these interviews, we will have somebody tell a story for the very first time about something that really mattered to them. And we'll catch that. And that may be the perfect gem, the perfect 5-minute story out of an entire hour's worth of an interview, and it will come as a gift. That doesn't happen all that often, but boy, what a wonderful experience it is, even on a rare basis to have it. Okay, I'm going to just conclude with a few, maybe one other technical thing, and this is really where a podcast innovated for us, where I realized, boy, this is different from broadcasting. One of the big things that always stands between you or another person's being natural there and being natural to an audience is all the gear in between you. The fact that it's got, that gear is there to translate you to somebody who isn't there. How do you get past the barrier that the microphone is for so many people, for yourself or for someone else? How can you make the microphone ultimately invisible? Now, there's some ways in which a microphone physically is also a barrier. If you're sitting across from somebody and you both have large microphones, you can't see their whole face. You don't have a clear line of sight to them. And also, in order to keep your signal in the microphone, you're, in a sense, invisibly, your head is invisibly chained to the microphone because you don't want to move away from the microphone. And what does that do to the rest of your body? In a sense, you're impaled on the microphone, and your body language suddenly becomes illiterate. You know, it becomes unexpressive. I mean, these are some of the things that happen with a microphone. So how do you make a microphone go away? Well, as Dan or I'm sorry, was it Joe? Paul. Yeah, names, I'm sorry. I love you, Paul. I just can't remember your name. I wish there were a sign you could wear at my age, you know, that just says that. I love you, but I can't remember your name. Anyway, it usually happens when you're really close to somebody you care for during an introduction. Anyway, as Frank over there was saying, what were you saying? You know, I just forgot what it was that you were talking about. Something about microphones? Oh, well, it doesn't matter. Oh, yeah, the lavalier. Or maybe it was Dan who said it. Oh, who cares? Dan was talking about lavaliers, right? He said, so yeah, microphones have gotten small enough that you could attach a lavalier to yourself, and then you'd have the body language back. But the process of reaching over and sticking a lavalier on somebody and then having it on yourself is time-consuming. It tends to break the mood, and in a way, you're kind of laying hands on them, on somebody who isn't relaxed to begin with. So how do you make the microphone go away? Well, our wonderful engineer, we have many engineers, but the one who has been working with us perhaps the longest, Antonio Oliart, said, well, you know, we have these tiny little microphones that are broadcast quality now. We use them to mic operas. He said, why don't we just wear one of these microphones? He said, I know what. Let's put them on a baseball cap. So, you know, the baseball cap, the brim of the baseball cap is sort of like a sound baffle right above your nose. It moves with you. You sound great, and you're able to do everything you would do in a normal conversation. You're able to have a line of sight. You can move your body. I find I very often put my feet up on the table as long as it's not culturally insulting to the guest. And, you know, nowadays you really have to check about something like that. You can begin to sound natural again. So that's just one of the ways in which podcasting has really led for us to innovations, and how, as the tugboat, we are coming up with a device which other people are beginning to use. So there are some people now who say they want the hat mic, you know, and sometimes, in fact, the hats disappear. So anyway, that's part of what podcasting is. I guess, just to wrap it all up, the thing that I'm suggesting about podcasting, based at least on my experience, is that in addition to being all these things, a technical innovation and a form of distribution and a revolution in the history of broadcasting and everything, it is also a new medium. I think it's becoming a new medium with a language and a series of moves of its own. And a medium which not only I think will grow, continue to grow, because I think it's here to stay now, I think it's got legs, that may even get to be big enough that it will, in a sense, ingest broadcasting as part of it. So you should feel like you're pioneers in a new venture. And as with most new mediums, as they develop, the most innovative stuff comes from the newcomers. It doesn't come from the old-timers. They're too locked into a point of view based upon their own previous failures and successes, you know, in the previous medium. Great ideas are coming from podcasters in general about things that might be incorporated into broadcast. And we, in fact, have created so much material from Morning Stories, the podcast, we probably have enough now to do a weekly broadcast series that we could distribute nationally. So in a sense, it's already feeding back into radio. But let me tell you, if somebody comes to you and says, I'm doing this, or I want to do this, or what do you think about my doing this so that I can get into radio or broadcasting? Well, let me suggest that my final piece of advice to you, don't. Don't. Traditional broadcasting right now is really in a disrupted state trying to figure out how it can hold on to its own assets. That didn't come out the way I guess it did, yes. Thank you, Paul. It doesn't have a clear disposition to take in a new voice or a new style. But to the extent that you innovate, to the extent that you have fun, to the extent that you continue this conversation with your audience and let them give you new ideas about how you want to grow. And it is true that nobody who starts a podcast ends up doing the podcast the same way 2 or 3 months after they've got started. You're part of a growing medium. So do that, enjoy the process, let it remain as much fun as possible for you, because there ain't no money in it at this point. And then, if you really want, let broadcasting come to you. And they may suddenly realize, as I occasionally do, boy, we should get this on our broadcast schedule. So I'm beginning to start to make calls, you know, to have podcasters come into the fold, such as it is, because they're doing something different. And broadcasting needs that fresh blood. They're doing something that broadcasting as a whole has stopped doing long ago. I guess that's about it. So, you have any questions?
Questions for Tony? We've got a few minutes. Hang on, we'll get that microphone.
Yeah.
I'll take care of this one. May have to turn that one on.
Testing. Tony, thank you. Sam Levin with Pod Show.
Oh, thank you, Sam.
And you mentioned something at the end of your conversation about there ain't no money in it.
I was
And-
generalizing.
No, I understand, but I think there's a lot of misperceptions about what's going on with podcasting because it's so new and so nascent, but major corporations are now using podcasting as a delivery to market. We at Pod Show understand that, and I think it's really interesting. You might want to touch on this, how people are really making money, and that's part of what Pod Show is doing, is taking it and helping people commercialize what they're doing.
My experience, and again, it's the only thing I can speak from. I wouldn't dare speak for the thousands and thousands of other people who've got different experiences or different ideas about how this works. My experience has been that the people who are basically making money in podcasting right now are the ones who are selling services to people who would like to be able to make money in podcasting. Which is, and believe me, I'm not singling out any one operation because I think it's wrong to assume that there's anything black and white about this. This is all such early days that the ways in which all these factors are going to interconnect is anybody's guess. All I'm saying is that it's clear that that is a particular way in which you can, in fact, get rewarded by a corporation or a group of individuals to offer them the expertise that you may be able to bring as a communicator. And I was just out in LA where, you know, most of the people who've heard about podcasting still have not heard a podcast. And, what they're thinking about is hiring a consultant to come in to help them do a podcast. The bigger you are, the more consultants you feel you need. An elephant can't tap dance, but it can have somebody sort of come in there and say, well, if you could, it would sound like this. Clickety, clickety, clickety. I'm being unfair to countless thousands of people who I'm sure have the best interests besides their own at heart. But I don't see really passionate podcasters doing it for any other reason than that they just can't help themselves from doing it. And I thank God for that.
Next one's here.
Hi, my name is Jeff Pike.
Hi, Jeff.
I have a question about truthfulness. We're talking about having people tell stories, and you are working for GBH. What's the extent of your responsibility to fact check or know that the story you're getting or putting out is a real story?
Good question. We're not an exercise in journalism, so we're not representing ourselves as presenting some factual truth. Our stories are all framed to be a person's individual experience and what it was like to go through that. Some moment of significance in their lives. It can be big, it can be small, but it works. You feel it. To the extent that we change any of it, and we do in the editing. I've taken, for instance, something that somebody said, not only put it at the end when it was at the beginning, but I may have actually taken it, turned it around, reversed the sentence so that the second part comes in the first, and used it a second time over there so it looks like they're commenting on themselves. And I always, based upon my own principle, which is that I am there to do what I can to help someone tell their story. So I go back to the person and I say, I've made a significant change, I think. Tell me if this is the story that you wanted to tell. And so that is the final approval. I mean, storytelling is also an art. Editing and all these things are coming into play. The whole idea is to create something that feels simple and effortless, so you try to hide your moves. But the ultimate issue in this is that, and it's one that is so strong a principle that I hope that carries across, and that's part of what attracts other people, is that you really respect an individual's experience, and you want to give them as much help as you can in getting that out in a story form. So, we have yet to be called on something that was untrue. What we tend to be called on is somebody saying, I heard I heard your podcast about somebody. I knew him. Let me tell you more about what this person was like. Or can you help me get in touch with that person? It doesn't mean that, at some point we won't make a mistake. But as I say, we'll know it's a mistake, hopefully, right away, and we'll learn something from it.
Okay, my name is Bill Dorley. I'm a writer from Pittsburgh, and I'm here mostly on my own just to try to figure out what's going on. But I just wanted to...
Welcome to the club.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to make a comment about, yes, corporations are doing podcasts now, and I've listened to a number of them. And with all respect, they aren't as good. And I would put good in quotes, simply because they come off as being they come off exactly as the same kind of slick, professionally produced, and I should know because I've written my share of them, PR kinds of productions that we're used to getting from corporations. And not just corporations, I mean all kinds of organizations, universities, broadcast organizations and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with it, but I find that the ones that I'm most interested in are the ones that are produced by people who have some personal interest in what they're doing. Just to put in a plug for one of my favorites, Slacker Astronomy,
I love
produced right
Slacker
here in
Astronomy.
Boston.
I have it's on my my iPod, as a matter of fact.
I'm way behind in listening, in fact.
So am I.
Got to go home tonight and
I
listen
have
to some more.
700 hours of stuff. I don't know. I mean, that's a real serious problem once you get into this.
Exactly,
How
yeah.
do you manage the flow? It's-
Yeah, I have to get a longer commute, actually, so I can listen to more.
You just
Thank
drive
you.
around in a circle, you get in the car, and I have to go out, honey. Why? I just have to. Let me just add to that our experience, by the way, in public radio is not unlike what you're talking about, that the big institutions that already have experience and an investment and a huge inventory in a particular kind of product that was made already for broadcast in a certain style, see podcasting at this point mostly as an additional means of distribution. They are not really thinking that it's an opportunity to create something original to the form. It's very hard, obviously, for something that is a collection of individuals to do that. But the individual, him or herself, is free to do that. And that's what's amazing about podcasting. What was so lucky about Morning Stories is that we were so off the screen that even though we were within this institution, it was not only foresighted enough to let us do it, but it was also unaware enough that it didn't bother them.
Okay, we're out of time, but we're going to take one last question with the mic over there.
Be quick about it, thank you. Tony, you're talking about authentic story, authentic communication, conversation, storytelling. What are some of those soft skills that perhaps we're not getting here that we could develop to make our podcasts better in that respect?
Well, it deserves a really good practical answer. I think there are 100 different things you start to do that are right for you once you get the idea that a story is something that really is an embodiment for an individual, at least the kind of stories we're after, an embodiment of a moment that really mattered and that's still happening in some way to them. But I find that one thing that's often very helpful besides just listening and, echoing whatever emotion I'm getting from them, because emotion is really they say that ants follow pheromones to get to the food. Emotion is our pheromone, we're really kind of sense that and go for it, is to, when you're listening, part of listening is to listen very carefully to yourself while you're hearing somebody else's story. Don't think ahead. Listening to yourself is a very active process. What it means is sensing that you've suddenly responded to something and following that. Don't just set it aside. I mean, if all of a sudden a detail jumps out at you, and it's often in the details, or if you find yourself suddenly uncomfortable or excited or whatever, that is probably a very good indication that that's the story speaking to you, the thing that will become part of the story, that is already, just keep on tugging at that. So I would say that's one thing you can definitely do. Learn how to listen to your own responses. Pay a lot of attention to what's going on inside you while someone's talking to you.
Those of you who haven't had a chance to listen to Morning Stories, I hope after hearing Tony talk that you will. Every little morning story is sort of a painting. It's a jewel unto itself. As a former motion picture sound editor in a previous lifetime, if I had the time, it's the kind of podcast I would like to produce. And I think Tony's comment about listening is really important. Now that we have so many things that we can listen to, we don't have just radio to listen to. We have other podcasts. We can go out and listen to what's out there, and we can try and understand what it is we like and why we like it. One of the first things I think people have to get over is a sense of what you're supposed to sound like. And if podcasting's done anything for me, in that regard, it's helped me understand that there is no supposed to sound like. It's not like the AM announcer. It's not the FM announcer. It's not even the Tony Khan. It's something that will hopefully come from you. And when it works, I think that what you'll find is that you can say, I feel good about this. I'm speaking a way that I want to communicate. I'm listening in a way that I want to listen. So anyway, Tony, thank you very much.
Thanks, Toby.